to also going to help our people, our organization, to properly lead our mission, which is to liberate African people worldwide. So I call upon their name, I call upon the name of the freedom fighter to come among us, and so that we can be inspired and we can come with the proper solution for the problem that we have. I'll always gonna ask the ancestor to provide to our people good health, security, and also opportunity, abundance of opportunity while we are on Earth here. To continue to protect our organization and sister organization, fight alongside with us, so that we reach that goal of victory. So unity is our aim, and victory is our destiny. Ashe.
Ashe.
All right.
Ashe.
How you go? Oh, Omowale, you?
I'm here, brother.
Okay.
I am here. Sister Wahida, can you just confirm that we are good on YouTube, and you can go ahead and share that in the Slack and on our Facebook, and I'm gonna get started right away. So let me just share my screen. All right, perfect. All right, Hotep family. Today we have a very, very special discussion that we are going to have with Dr. Molefi Kete Asante, who is the founder and international organizer of Afrocentricity International. For those of you who may know, we are in the middle, we're actually towards the end of AI Week 2020. So annually, our organization or our chapter in Philadelphia, we put on a week of activities from Malcolm X Day through African Liberation Day. So from May the 19th through the 25th of May. And today's discussion is going to be centered around reimagining the movement towards a unified Africa. So what I'd like to do just very quickly to prepare us just to dive into the discussion is I'd like to briefly just speak to the aim or the outcome that we're looking to attain through our talk today. So I don't know if you recall, Dr. Asante, but I sent you this email back in May, back in December of last year, requesting this particular conversation. And the email just basically stated that as a longtime Garveyite and maturing Afrocentrist, this particular idea is one that I've come to see as less than ideal as a solution to our current situation. My position is that the unification of Africa, our ultimate goal, will not be achieved through the United States of Africa. I said that while the idea has garnered much excitement through the 20th and the early 21st century, I believe that it will need to be transformed if it is to be reborn in the hearts and minds of the next generation. And I stated that it was my hope that through engaging in public dialogue, we can re-energize the United States of Africa question and insert some much needed new energy into the movement towards a unified Africa. So today, ultimately with this discussion, we're looking to basically just to facilitate a discussion with the objective of hearing new ideas and strengthening old ones as it pertains to the United States of Africa. So immediately following the fireside chat with Dr. Asante, we will have a panel of young Pan-Africanists from across the globe. Some very notable names, including Dr. Obadele Kambone, who's headquartered in Ghana, Brother Shaka Ra, who's in the UK. Too many names to actually list right now, but you will see them all at about 3:50 p.m. And also our very own Shanuti Lasmi from AI Philly will be participating in that panel that starts at 3:50 p.m. But what I wanted to do, Dr. Asante, before I give you your formal introduction is I was hoping that throughout this conversation, we can really use it, right, when discussing the concept of the United States of Africa to examine the two competing visions for unified Africa. So that of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, or Nana Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and Nana Kwame Nkrumah. And basically, in terms of like those competing visions, before we even get to your intro, if we look at like Garvey's Pan-African vision, Garvey stated very clearly, and I took both of these quotes coming out of the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. Garvey stated that in the solution to the Negro problem, he said that the future of the Negro, therefore, outside of Africa, spells ruin and disaster. He said, therefore, the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization among Negroes that is seeking to improve the condition of the race with the view of establishing a nation in Africa, right? A Pan-African state where Negroes will be given the opportunity to develop by themselves, right? So Garvey's vision is the creation of this Pan-African state on the African continent. He used art, he used poetry to articulate that vision. Most famously known is the poem that he did in 1924, titled "The United States of Africa," to articulate his particular vision. Nkrumah had somewhat deviated with Garvey when it came to Garvey's vision of a Black or an African state on the continent. So what I pulled here just really quick is a quote that came from Kwame Nkrumah's autobiography in 1957. Many of us know that 1957 is the year that Ghana gained its independence. But in this particular quote, he's dealing with the four Pan-African Congresses that occurred prior to the 1945 Congress. And he's also addressing Garveyism directly. So what he says here is that the main reason it achieved so much was because for the first time, the delegates who attended it were practical men and men of action, and not, as was the case of the four previous conferences, merely idealists contenting themselves with writing theses, but quite unable or unwilling to take any active part in dealing with the African problem. Like Garveyism, the first four conferences were not born of indigenous African consciousness. Garvey's ideology was concerned with Black nationalism as opposed to African nationalism. This fifth Pan-African Congress provided the outlet for African nationalism. It became, in fact, a mass movement of Africa for the Africans. Apologies, that's a typo on my part. And then just last but not least, Nkrumah would go on to cast his vision in 1958, where he hosted two conferences in Ghana. The first was in April of 1958. It was a conference of the heads of independent African states. And the second was a conference in December of 1958 that he referred to as the All African Peoples Conference. And the first, where he met with the heads of state, he casted a vision for a multi-racial community that he defined as the United States of Africa. So I'm just going to read this quote here. He says, "We, the independent states of Africa, seek to eliminate racialism by our own example of a tolerant multiracial community reflecting the freely expressed will of the people. Today, we are one. If in the past the Sahara divided us, now it unites us, and an injury to one is an injury to all of us. From this conference must go out a new message. Hands off Africa. Africa must be free." And then December in 1958, he would go on to state what he believed are the four main stages of Pan-Africanism. The first, he stated, was national independence, so the freeing of the colonial state from the previous colonial master. The second was national consolidation. The third, transnational unity and community. The fourth, economic and social reconstruction on the principles of scientific socialism. And he stated that with these goals, the ultimate goal was to work towards the achievement of a union or commonwealth of African states. And what I just have highlighted here on the side, these particular images, are Nkrumah's call to independence. You notice he states, attention, all Africans, right? The switch from Pan-African to all African. But he states very clearly in terms of the purpose of the conference, he says that this conference will formulate and proclaim our African personality based on the philosophy of Pan-African socialism as the ideology of the African nonviolent revolution. Henceforth, our slogan shall be, people of Africa, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a continent to regain. You have freedom and human dignity to attain. And to the colonialists, we say, hands off Africa. Africa must be free. So with that, just very brief, I guess, preface before we get into our discussion today with our distinguished guest, Dr. Molefi Kete Asante. For those of you who do not know him, I'll just do a very brief introduction. Dr. Asante is among the most published African authors with more than 400 publications, including 70 books. He currently serves as the chair of the Department of Africology at Temple University. He created the first PhD program in African American Studies in 1987. Also co-edited the encyclopedias of Black Studies and the Encyclopedia of African Religion with Dr. Mazama. He's the founder of the Molefi Kete Asante Institute for Afrocentric Studies, the co-founder of Afrocentricity International, and currently serves as the international organizer and our sesh. And a very important note pertaining to this discussion is in 2005, Dr. Asante was the only representative from the African diaspora to attend the Abuja Conference of Heads of State and African Intellectuals, where they explicitly discussed the United States of Africa. So in preparation for today's talk, I actually went back and read the article that Dr. Asante wrote about that particular conference. The article's title, and you can find it on his website at asante.net. The article's title was Toward an African State. In 2010, Dr. Asante published a paper called Afrocentricity and the Argument for Civic Commitment, Ideology and Citizenship in the United States of Africa. And then 2012, he gave a talk at Villanova on negritude in the United States of Africa. So in preparation for today's discussion, fireside chat with Sesh Molefi, I went back and read through those documents and listened to those lectures. So with that being said, welcome to the platform, Dr. Asante. We're glad to have you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so let me stop sharing my screen here. All right, so I guess the first question I guess that I would have for you, as it pertains to the two visions that were cast, whether it be in Nkrumah or Garvey, like what do you see as the differentiator in their visions when they're discussing the United States of Africa and focusing on the word Africa within that phraseology?
Well, I thank you very much for the question, and I think it's a very appropriate question, and it's a good question. The two visions represent two different contexts. It represents two different, what I mean by that, two different times. And it represents the fact that Garvey's movement, particularly at the top of the 20th century, was a movement that saw Black people, by virtue of the issue of race, as the central factor in the movement toward his brand of Pan-Africanism. He saw that nowhere in the world was there really an active Black state, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, and neither one of those states expressed the Pan-African view. So what he wanted to do was to create a Black nationalism where Black people around the world, including those in Africa and those abroad, would come together and create this one overarching Black nation. 35 years later or so, when Nkrumah was expressing his view, and particularly after the 45 Manchester Conference, he saw the realities of Africa of that day. And the realities of Africa at that day, particularly in the early 50s, was different from what had been seen by Garvey. They saw two different Africas, and they saw two different groups. Nkrumah felt that it was necessary to look at the continental situations, geographical situations of Africa, and to propose that African nationalism, instead of Black nationalism, become the central factor in bringing together the independent states, ultimately all of the independent states of Africa. And that was different, and that vision, those two tensions still exist in Pan-Africanism. They're fundamental to it. And so if you ask me, I see problems in both sides. So I'm not trying here to sort of find a seam. I'm simply trying to express the truth. For example, as far as Garvey was concerned, I am a Garveyite. in the sense that I believe that's essential for African people, wherever they are, to have an African consciousness. As far as Nkrumah is concerned, I'm a practical person. I do believe and accept that you cannot give up Northern Africa to the Arabs. I don't believe that. I think that's a part of Africa. And I think what we've got to do is to figure out how to live with that. And I think that's what Nkrumah was trying to do. And I take this position, even though I've had many discussions and had some intense discussions with perhaps one of the chief Garveyites of this era on the African continent, and that's Brother Chinwezu. We argued about this for about 3 hours in Lagos at a hotel. And here's where I come down. I come down on the fact that that Africa is a Black continent. I don't want to give it up. I don't want to say that we're looking for a Black nation, because if we say we're looking for a Black nation, then what do you do with all those Arabs, over 100 million, who live in Africa? What do you do with the white people who live in Southern Africa? I mean, you cannot do that. You have to see a geographical African continent. If you see a geographical African continent, you must not fear that Black people will be dominated by Arabs. I don't fear that. I don't have any fear that over 1 billion Black people will be taken over by 100 million Arabs. I don't have that fear. I don't have a fear that the 1 million or so, or rather 5 million or so white people in Africa will take over the continent of Africa with over 1.5 billion people. That's just not practical. So I think you have to understand the realities of the situation. There's no way to have, it seems to me, a continental African, rather an African state where you sort of say, well, these areas this is going to be Black Africa, and it's going to be a nation unto itself, and the rest of Africa is just going to be out there. I don't take that position, and I find that position very difficult. I can't hear you.
Why are you mute?
I can't.
Apologies. No, what I was saying was I appreciate the answer to that question as well as the explanation. So I was stating that I guess my follow-up question would be, in dealing with the complexities of a multiracial, geographically based political entity, right? This entity referred to as the United States of Africa. How do you envision, because you stated, okay, you stated roughly about 100 million Arabs, right? But we know, historically speaking, that the Arab population there used Islam as the means by which they propelled their forward thrust into the continent. And likewise, the white population in South Africa used Christianity as the means by which they propelled their expansionist thrust into the continent. So when you have this religious conflict where not only do you have Arabs, right, or an Arabized Muslim population in the north, you also have a significant amount of African or Black converts to Islam, and then likewise in the south, you have a significant amount of Christianized Black converts to Christianity. So how do we develop a political entity and or Pan-African state in which the ideology of so many Black people on the continent is propelled by religions that are, I would say, quite frankly, anti-African? Like, how do we deal with that particular challenge?
I think you've asked a very good question, and I think it's a very pointed question. And I just want to speak to it, and then add something that I forgot to add earlier. But let me speak to this because I think it's extremely significant issue. The reason we have this problem on the African continent is because Africa itself has never expressed its own ideological position. That is the problem. And that is one of the reasons your organization, Afrocentricity International, was developed, to try to create for the African continent an Afrocentric consciousness, so that you don't have to make a racial argument here. You make an Afrocentric argument. And that brings me to, you got the Christian invasion, you got the Islamic invasion, and they can invade Africa because Africa does not speak for itself. It has nothing that it says. If you talk to an African, most likely the African will either be Muslim or be Christian, even though they have a traditional veneer, or they would have a traditional base, but their veneers will always be Islamic or Christian, because they see that as more highly valued than to say, I'm an African. All right, now that brings me to the question that I missed at the beginning, the point that I wanted to make with Nkrumah. I talk about Garvey, but there's some wrong with Nkrumah's vision too. What was wrong with Nkrumah's vision was that the 1945 Pan-African Congress at Manchester was something that really, until now, I think, we have never really analyzed. Because when you read, for example, what Nkrumah said, and it was correct, what he said, what you read, what he said was that you would have a united Africa under scientific socialism. That was a mistake. It was an error. But it was not an error that we could have pointed out at the time if we had been living and being at that conference, because what it was a reaction to colonialism and to capitalism. And so what they did by saying that it had to be Pan-Africanism on the basis of socialism, they took the Soviet model and they took that structure, particularly under the influence of Lenin, and they provided this position for all African independent movements. So the independent movements of Africa were all socialists. There's no independent movement in Africa that was on the side of the colonialists or capitalists. There was one that tried, that sought that position, but it was defeated in Angola. So, but there was no, what you had was a situation where the philosophy coming out of the 1945 Manchester Congress was dictated by George Padmore. Now, who was Padmore? Padmore was a Trinidadian who went to Howard for a year. He had been invited to Howard. He was around 20-some years old, been invited to Howard. He went to school there for a year, and then he was recruited by the Communist Party to become their chief propagandist in the US. And then 2 years after, a year and a half or so after he's in the US as a propagandist for the Soviet Union, he was brought to Moscow. They took him to Moscow, and he became, in the Moscow bureau, he became the leading propagandist for the African continent. So he, out of his socialist structure, that's why the book, my 92nd book, which will be coming out in about 2 months, is called The Afrocentric Pan-Africanist Vision. And the reason I call it an Afrocentric Pan-Africanist vision is because the socialist Pan-African vision has brought us failure.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Asante. I'll be speaking on that same topic next month. I have a lecture that I'm giving, the Pan-African Costume Ball and the Climate of Confusion.
I love that.
I'm dealing with the socialist version of Pan-Africanism, but I'm also dealing with the capitalist version and all the other versions that are out there. So I'll be speaking to that. Okay, you raised a very, a poignant point that I guess I want to address here. You talked about the need for there to exist an Afrocentric consciousness, right? I know you have this statement that, consciousness precedes unity, right? So if we are going to achieve, a unified Africa, then it needs to be, that Afrocentric ideology needs to be first and foremost. But I guess my challenge here, and this is going to be a sticky question for you, is that can you have an Afrocentric consciousness and be Christian and or Muslim at the same time? And the reason why I ask that is because if the bedrock of these invader ideologies, meaning Christianity and Islam, states that these other people, whether they be Arab and or European, have a right to take from Africans, meaning Black people, because Black people are deemed as cursed from their mythology or ideology that has driven their movement into the continent, then can the two coexist side by side or within one person? So me, can I be Afrocentric on this side and then Christian on the other?
Well, no, it's not a sticky question. It's a correct question. And that's why I always tell people, I'm neither Muslim, nor Christian, nor Jewish, nor Buddhist. I'm an African. African is the only religion that I confess to. And in fact, if you are not African, then it's almost totally impossible for you to express an Afrocentric idea where your interest, your fundamental interest is Africa. Otherwise, your fundamental interest becomes Islam or Mecca or Christianity in Jerusalem. I mean, no, that's not of interest to me. And I think that's why I said earlier that the problem with the whole discussion of Pan-Africanism in the 1945 Manchester Congress was because the Africans couldn't come to grip with that question. And the only way that they could deal with it was not to even call it communism, what they were. They said, well, it's going to be scientific socialism. It's going, because some people were saying, well, we already have socialism in Africa. The communalism of Africa is socialism. They said, no, it has to be scientific, which means it has to be European. And so then they make this big argument. And they make that argument because nobody could express, or if they did express, I've never read it in any documents, if somebody make it stand up and say, look, we should interrogate first, question first, what are the values of Africa? What are the spiritual qualities of Africa? What are the economic parts of Africa that we can use in a modern economy? What are the traditions and characteristics of us as a people? Nobody made that argument because Padmore was very clear that the only way forward for Pan-Africanism was to align itself with the Soviet Union and to become a Pan-Africanism under scientific socialism. That was a fundamental flaw, and it was a serious mistake.
All right. I guess you and I are members of the same religion because I consider,
I like that.
I consider myself an African as well.
I was a little worried. I was a little worried. I'd say, I mean, no, it's not a sticky issue to me.
All right. So I guess, okay. So here's the next question then. So African. Nkrumah seems to, I guess, postulate in his articulation of his vision that African speaks to anyone who is within the borders of Africa. He's identifying as African. Whereas though Garvey, in a more of a race first, if you look at like the late 19th century where Du Bois is referring to pan-Negroism, right? Like, so when he's saying African, he's referring to the Black people on the continent and African people throughout the diaspora. That's why he has the, Africans at home and abroad, in his statement. So how do we deal with that conflict of African identity?
Well, I think it's very clear. It's a very good question that you raised, and I appreciate it very much. I think that, as I said earlier about the context, I think that with Garvey, what he saw all around the world was a persecution of Black people because of Blackness. And whether that was in Costa Rica, when he went down there, wherever he went, Panama, in the United States, in Jamaica, wherever, in England, wherever he went, he saw the persecution of Black people because we were Black, or we are Black. And that became a fundamental thing for him. I think, on the other hand, in Nkrumah's case, particularly given the fact that the first two nations on the continent of Africa, if we take the fact that after Liberia and Ethiopia, which were considered independent countries, the first two countries were countries in the north. They were Egypt and Sudan. And now we normally forget Sudan because we normally say Ghana was the first independent country, but actually Sudan was independent before Ghana. But Sudan at the time, even though if you see Sudan and know Sudan, it's overwhelmingly a Black country, but they defined themselves as Arabs. It was the Arab Republic. So Sudan was a country that is still confused. There's a lot of confusion. So what Nkrumah attempted to do was to say, even those countries in the north, like Libya and Tunisia and Algeria particularly, and Morocco and Egypt and Sudan, those countries also should be considered within the context of the United States of Africa. So his was a political move, but it was not necessarily a global move. He didn't say, well, now we should put the Jamaicans in and the Haitians in and the African Americans and the Africans in Canada or the Africans in Brazil. He just simply said geographically that the continent should be one and should be singular. It should not be, there's no such thing as Black Africa and white Africa. It's just Africa. And so that was a legitimate position in my frame of reference, because I don't see politically any other way to define the concept of continental unity with by simply trying to isolate certain nations of Africa. It is almost an impracticable thing, an impractical thing. What you have to do is define the Pan-Africanism as an Afrocentric Pan-Africanism. And in fact, let me just say this. I think that part of what we misunderstand, even with all of his flaws, that this was what Gaddafi was trying to do. And he attempted to do it on several occasions. I heard him give a speech on this once. And it was very, very clear in my mind that what he wanted to say was that, look, this continent with over 1 billion Black people, it has to assert itself. This is not an Arab continent. He said that. This is not an Arab continent. This is an African continent. And the Arabs who are here must see it as an African continent. But Africa has never asserted itself that way because it's not Afrocentric. And because you have Christians fighting against the Muslims, and you have the colonialists, or the neo-colonialists. You have many divisions, and you don't have an ideological position. The only legitimate ideological position is to be an Afrocentrist. And this is the position that I took in 2005 when I met with the subcommittee of the African presidents in Abuja, that this had to happen. They had to do it. And it was a shame that the African presidents, only one of them stood fast on this position. And that was Abdoulaye Wade from Senegal. But my good friend, Thabo Mbeki, whom I appreciate so much, because I think of uncorruptible leaders, I believe that he's one of the few in Africa, but was in Africa. He's no longer president, but Thabo Mbeki was there. But he declared that South Africa wouldn't join the movement to a united Africa. And Ethiopia declared at the time that they wouldn't join a United States of Africa. So the only person who, Kufuor, of course, who was at that time leading Ghana, actually missed the important meeting where they had to decide this. But the interesting thing to me was at that meeting was the only person who stood up and said something that was extremely positive about this was Wade, who said, if we could bring this to happen tomorrow, I would gladly be the governor of Senegal tomorrow. I would give up this thing. But all the rest of them were talking about their own traditions or their own sense of sovereignty and so on. Well, sovereignty is a false concept. It's a concept that the Europeans created to stop the 30 Years' War in Europe. And it had nothing to do with the traditions of Africa. But we've bought into it, and we've accepted that. And that has become a part of the African orientation to our own unity and so forth.
All right. So following up on your experience in Abuja in 2005, 15 years later, do you still believe that a political unification can be achieved by the African heads of state, or
No.
do you think that this is a grassroots thrust that needs to occur?
It cannot be achieved by the African heads of state. Heads of state. It will not be achieved that way. It will never be achieved that way. It has to be achieved through the grassroots. That's why Afrocentricity International, I think, is one of the most powerful organizations, because Afrocentricity International says, and I take Paradama Mazama on this because she's exactly correct, that it has to begin with the masses of people who want to be united. They want to have a united Africa. They want to have a united African people. These are the grassroots people. They must demand that of their leaders, and then their leaders will do it. Almost all the leaders who get to be president, they have no ideological position related to Pan-Africanism. Once they get to be political leaders, then they claim that they are Pan-Africanists, but they don't have the courage. I don't know one leader right now on the continent, I'm just thinking, on the continent who has a position, who's willing to state to stake his or her political position to fight in the interest of a commonality for establishing a United States of Africa. The last one to publicly do that was murdered, and that was Muammar Gaddafi. So I don't, and the other one was deposed. That was Mugabe. But I don't see it happening. I don't think that we should look to presidents, and that's why when I came away from the 2005 conference, where I was invited as a member of the delegation from Senegal, when I came away from that with Foreign Minister Tidiane Gadio of Senegal, I felt like it was necessary for us to create a movement, launch a movement among the masses of people. Because the masses of people, if you talk to the masses of people in any of these African countries, they will be for unity. They are for it. It's not it's the leadership. The leadership is weak. The leadership is not strong. And the leadership is sometimes, quite frankly, ignorant of history. They don't know, they have no sense of a large context and don't talk about a global context. When I was in Colombia, for example, the people in Colombia, the Black people in Colombia, 30% of the population of Colombia is Black. And when you're in a city like Buenaventura, which is 90% African, the people say to you, these African presidents, they come down here to visit the president in Bogota. They go to Bogota, they go to all these balls, and they never raise a question, what are you doing for our Black brothers and sisters in Colombia? They never raise those questions to these leaders in South America, even though they go, the presidents of African countries, nations, they go to Brazil, they go to Colombia, they go to Ecuador, they go to Uruguay, these countries where they're Black population, but they never speak in the interest of Black people. Only people who do that consistently are Africans in the diaspora. The Africans in the diaspora, and I say this too, and my continental brothers and sisters who may even hear this will know this. The Africans on the continent have limited visions of these things. And this is why it was true what Karenga used to say. He said, you take a whole ethnic view of the world. And we said, well, I'm Zulu, I'm Yoruba, I'm Kikuyu. No, he said, no, we Africans in the diaspora, we take a large view, a global view of the African world. And that's why we are able to function. And that's why we function in a way that's most effective for bringing African ideas into play.
All right, Dr. Asante, it's almost 3:45. So
I gotta get out of here.
I got a quick two-part question that you could finish off on for us. The first part of the question is because you talked about the unification being achieved through the masses. So my question becomes, can the masses of our people on the continent achieve a unified Africa while still enslaved within the confines of the colonial state? To ask it a different way, can we use European fabric to build an African garment, right? Because the colonial state was built and constructed for theft, for Europe to steal our resources. The only thing that changed in the independence period is you now got Black people or Africans who are leading the colonial states, but its function never changed. So can that Pan-African identity or Pan-African unification be achieved while the colonial identity and colonial state still exists? And then the last part of that question is, what is the role of Africans in the diaspora in achieving that vision of, or assisting to achieve that role, that vision of a unified Africa?
Well, we're going to have to, this is a good question. We're going to have to critically examine all African political forms as we move forward, trying to bring into existence any kind of unity. If we talk about United States of Africa, we have to question the political structure. I always give this example. I'm Chidom Hini of Tafo. I was installed in 1993 in Achim in Ghana, right? So look at this. No person that I can think of, take it even at the higher level. Let's go to the Asante Hene of the Asante people in Kumasi. Nobody that I know of will march into Kumasi and take over the palace of Opoku, rather Osei Tutu. You won't do that. But we have had in these modern European colonial political structures coup d'etats. Why people don't do it with the traditions? They don't do it with the traditions because the traditions are organic to the people. So yes, we have to examine the whole question of the political structure. Right now, the AU is following basically a European model. I mean, in everything, whether you talk about presidents and all this kind of stuff. So we gotta re-examine that. Then the thing with the African diaspora, the role of the African diaspora is to put pressure on all African political leaders, while at the same time having a relationship, a social, political, and economic relationship with the masses. That's our role for the United States of Africa. Otherwise, I don't think we have a particular role, given the fact that there are African states now who talk about a role for the diaspora, but they're most often when they talk about that, they're talking about a role for their own national diaspora. It's like when Nigeria is talking about its diaspora. I went to a legislative meeting in Nigeria to talk about diaspora. And when I got there, I discovered what they were talking about was all those Nigerian doctors and lawyers who are in England and the United States sending money back to Nigeria, that they need to get in touch with the Yoruba and the Igbo and the Hausa diaspora around the world and bring money, because they said, we want a diaspora that will support us like the Indian diaspora in England and the United States support India. And that was a and I say that because the Africans in the United States and in the West, in the Caribbean and in South America, we're talking about, well, they're going to build a region that's going to be for us. No, they ain't talking about you. They're talking about their people who have left and stayed in America with their PhDs and all that and their engineering degree. They want those people to contribute to their villages, contribute to their hometowns, contribute to education and health and so forth. So anyway, we got a lot to talk about, but I appreciate, thank you, ANI Vice Shanudi. I appreciate y'all very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Asante.
Asante.
All right, hold up.
Hold up.
All right, so Dr. Asante just dropped off. I see a few of my panelists for the 4 p.m. discussion have already joined. So Sister Jessica Ann Mitchell, Awuya, please forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong. You can turn your camera on and come in. I believe Sister Marsha is here. You can turn your camera on and come in. Who else is here from the Hotep? Sister Marsha, how are you? You're okay. There you go. I can hear you now.
Hi. Good evening. Hi.
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I was just listening to that conversation. It was interesting. Occasionally, I will mute because I have people running around in the background. Okay.
That's not a problem at all. That's not a problem at all. So I'm waiting for the remaining. I asked everyone to try to get here by 3, but our panel discussion is going to start at 4. Immediately following the chat with Dr. Asante. I thought it was a good discussion. So
yeah, it was very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. And you have a similar discussion happening tomorrow as well, right, on the United States of Africa.
Yeah, but I'm my part in that panel is really looking at what's happening within the diaspora, particularly within the UK, which is where I'm based, and the work that I'm doing with our Black youth here.
Okay. Well, when we do like the introductions, I would certainly like to hear more about the work you're doing locally.
Absolutely.
All right. So, Sister Jessica, are you there? I hope she didn't get kicked off.
I'm here. I'm going to my office. I had
to do
something with the kids real quick.
All right, not a problem. Not a problem at all. All right. Brother Rich, you were asking some good questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get them in. Dr. Asante is pressed for time. Those are some good questions in the chat. Same with Brother Tariq. Brother Tariq, turn your camera on, brother. Let's have a discussion. I don't want no dead space before the next panel starts.
What's up?
What's going on, brother? What'd you think of the one-on-one with Dr. Asante?
I think he had some very good points, especially as he started talking and getting into his rhythm. One of the questions I brought up, which maybe we can talk about, the folks that are here, is knowing how deep the miseducation is, not just in diaspora, but also on the continent, and knowing how deep the mis-socialization, us being socialized in these foreign ontologies, how do we come to even reconcile trying to build a national movement or international movement? Because I know that's one thing that's stricken all of our different international organizations, whether it's AI, ASCAC, the African Heritage Studies Association, where they come out with an Afrocentric or an African-centered organization, but then people come in with other ideas of what that means. What do you think about that whole idea?
I think that it all really boils down to like the concept of identity. And we as African people have lots of competing identities. And I think that we suffer from kind of like a fragmented consciousness, in terms of, and also which identities we prioritize and or prefer, right? For many African people or Black people, the concept of being African is something that is secondary. Before they even get to that identity, they are talking about their ethnic group, their region, their nationality. Now it's even more complex with like, on campus, now we're pushing the different gender identities and the different sexual identities, and people align themselves with groups based upon which of those identities mean the most to them. So as African people, the need for us developing a confederation of states or a unified political entity is that we need something that can protect us globally, because we as Black people across the globe, whether you're on the continent or in the diaspora, like we're all still catching the same hell. And I think we're going to continue to do that until we can unify behind an identity that makes us one, right? Garvey used to say, one God, one aim, one destiny.
Right.
But we can't get there as long as we're kind of like, picked apart and stuffed in these different buckets that keep us operating as individuals and don't allow us to achieve the collective power that our Africanness should provide us.
No, I
I'm
definitely
sorry.
hear that.
Yeah. Brother Snooty, get on the panel, brother. You on this panel. So
one thing that's interesting, you brought up identity, and that kind of gets into identity politics. But the core essence of identity politics goes back to this idea of individualism, right? It's about how you identify yourself. It's not really about how society interacts with each other or how your community interacts with itself, but it's how you as an individual view yourself. And that ultimately, I believe, goes back to the European ethos, where it's this whole idea of, if you guys have read Yurugu or even Michael Bradley's The Iceman Inheritance, it's the whole thing about how did Eurasian people become Eurasian people, right? They had to be individuals. And for us, that never made sense. So I appreciate what you were saying, where it's more about us. It's not each one of us. What it's the saying that the sum is greater than the all parts, right?
yep. So
I think I messed up the saying, but it's
no. I know the saying is the sum. The sum is better than the whole, or the sum of the parts is better than the whole, or it's the other way around. We both messing up the saying at this point. Sister Jessica Ann Mitchell, how do I pronounce your last name?
Iwuyor.
Iwuyor. Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. I got you. All right. We're just waiting on Dr. Obadele Cambone and Sister African Esquire. Dr. Obadele, as soon as I mentioned his name, he appeared, and look at this, Sister African Esquire.
I've been here.
Oh, you were okay. You were in the chat for Dr. Asante?
Yeah, I was here for the whole time.
All right, that's cool. All right, and I think Sister African Esquire just. All right, Hotep.
Right.
Look at this. They said black people can't be on time. They lied. All right. Sister African Esquire, we're streaming this live to YouTube. So, okay, there you go. Man, there's some beautiful black people on this panel. All right. Tariq, you are more than welcome to stay. What I'm going to do, I want to maintain some balance here, some Asara set. So let me see, I have 3 sisters and I got 5 brothers. So I'm going to hide myself. You know what I mean? On YouTube, they will see all you guys on YouTube. Your faces are going to be the only thing that's showing. All right, so I'll get started. I think really quick, what we'll do first is I'll allow each of you just to do some quick introductions, speak to who you are, what part of the world or diaspora or African world you are tuning in from today, and whatever it is that you have going on, whether it be organizing or any initiatives that you are currently involved in. So I'll ask Sister Marsha Garrett, you can go ahead and start first, and then we'll continue from there.
Hi, yes. So my name is Marsha Garrett. I'm based in the UK. I'm actually based in a very small town in the northeast of England. Born in England. I've been on my own journey with regards to understanding and connecting to my African heritage. And it hasn't been a straightforward one. And I think if I hadn't taken responsibility for my own education, I would never have got to this position where I'd be comfortable to sit on such a panel as this. So I think it's really important to identify the importance of self-education. The learning that I am doing is ongoing, and I think it will be for the rest of my life. But one of the things that I'm really passionate about is sharing my learning, my knowledge with young people. So I set up a Pan-African school for young people of African origin to teach them the history that they're not getting in school, because our young people in the UK, and I don't think it's specific to the UK, it's something within Western Europe, it's something within North America. I have many colleagues who have been born and raised on the continent who also tell me the same thing about a Eurocentric education system, which teaches us not only self-hate and inferiorization, but deliberately obscures and omits aspects of African history, which is vital for our self-love and self-knowledge. So that's what I share in our Pan-African School.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Sister Marsha. Brother Tariq, go ahead, you're next. You're our surprise guest on the panel today. So just go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know what any initiatives or organizations you're involved with.
Hotep. My name is Tariq Richardson. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Africology, African American Studies at Temple University, a student of Dr. Alma Mazama, Kamani Nahusi, and Molefi Kete Asante. I'm teaching a few classes coming up, so I'm working on building syllabuses. I'm not doing anything too extensive, but I'm teaching a class on the history of African and Black people in cinema, teaching a class on Black politics, and I'm also teaching a class about Blacks in world history. I didn't come up with the name of the classes. They were assigned to me, but I'm trying to make it work.
All right, Brother Shaka Ra, up next. You have to unmute, brother. Your mic is still muted.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. First of all, Tendai Mwadi. For those who may not be aware, Tendai Mwadi is spoken in the Shona language, which is mostly spoken in Zimbabwe. It simply means to be thankful unto the Creator, the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. I greet that way because I'm a member of a nationalist, Black nationalist, Pan-Africanist organization called the Al-Kebula Revivalist Movement. And we are basically a nationalist Pan-Africanist organization that is adherent to the legacies of the most eminent prophet, Marcus Messiah Garvey, and Omwale Malcolm X. And also at our foundation is a spiritual cultural foundation, an African-centered spiritual cultural foundation. I am also a spoken word artist, co-director of Got Kush TV, which is the UK's #1 Black conscious platform. And I am a member of UNIA ACL Division number 304. I reside in London, UK, and I am most humbled and pleasured to be here. So thank you for the invitation, Brother Omwale, and greetings to the leading forces behind Afrocentricity International, namely Baba Molefi Kete Asante and Mambo Ama Mazama, both of whom I've met. And I just want to say to Brother Tariq that I'm very, very well acquainted with Brother Kim Nehusi. He used to live in the UK, and he's a very well-known member of the Pan-African community in the UK. So we just give thanks, blessings.
All right. Okay, Sister, should I call you Jam Awuya or Jessica and Metro Awuya?
You can just say Jam, it's fine.
Okay, all right. Well, Sister Jam, you can go ahead, unmute, and just give your brief intro.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Jessica Ann Mitchell. I'm a publisher and a communications specialist. So I have a publishing company, Our Legacy Press, where I do cultural storytelling. And I also work with different organizations and nonprofits in communications. Right now, I am the communications chair for the Pan-African Congress North American delegation. And so we're hosting various events, we organize, and I spend a lot of time deconstructing false narratives that are targeted towards Africans in America.
All right, this is gonna be a great panel. All right, Brother Shanuti, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and do your brief intro.
Yes, I'll be really brief. So yes, Abdul Shanuti Lazmi. I'm the president of AI Philly, Afrocentricity International Philadelphia here. Okay, kind of redundant. AI Philadelphia. I'm an engineer by trade. I'm engineering the control system. And I'm also, I'm originally from a part of Africa called Gabon. But really Manji, this is where I'm from. And I've been the president of AI since 2017. So I want to thank Omwale for the invitation. And I hope that I will contribute in some ways to this discussion. And also I want to greet all the other panelists. I want to tell them I'm glad to be among you.
Okay, thank you, Brother Shanuti. Brother Obadile. Dr. Obadile Kambon. Did I say it right? I'm getting it. The 3 hi-hats. Obadile.
You're getting very close, and you know you have to know those tones because it's the exact same tones as your own name.
Yep.
Dele or Mowale.
Yep.
So both of those names are Yoruba. So you're getting there. This is much better than the first time. All right, so Obadile Kambon. I'm the founder of abibitumi.com. Abibitumi in the Tree language translates to Black Power, and that's what we're about. I'm also a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. I'm Damuchida Mhene, which is a traditional title at Ekwapim Mampong. I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I think everything else we can kind of learn about each other during the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Obadile. And last but not least, my sister African Esquire. You're going by your given name now, so do you want me to introduce you as?
Yeah, I mean, my name's Tierney Cherie.
Okay.
Most people, if you know me, you probably know me as hosting the African Esquire channel on YouTube. Basically, I'm just an attorney, but most importantly, I'm an organizer. I founded the organization We Charge Colonialism with a number of brothers and sisters. And just the purpose of that organization is that we're trying to bring light to the colonization of Africans in the United States and also have solidarity with Africans around the world who are all facing colonialism. So that's basically the organization that I primarily work with.
All right. So as you all can see, I mean, we have I would say a pretty nice panel of different Pan-African leaders from all over the globe represented here today. Were each of you able to tune in for the discussion with Dr. Asante before this panel started?
I caught some of it. I didn't catch all of it.
Okay. All right. So for those who attended, I'd be interested to just before we even get started, just to hear your feedback, any points of consideration or differentiation as to what you heard, just to get the discussion started before I start asking my questions.
Well, I asked the question about how the diaspora would be included in the creation and manifestation of the United States of Africa. As y'all know, right now, the African Union recognizes the diaspora as like the 6th region. And so I think in this discussion, it would be good to learn more about what you all think about the role of the diaspora. It was a really good response from Dr. Asante on the fact that we have to push our leadership and continue to spread throughout the diaspora and connect with the continent, knowing that we can't rely solely on political leadership to make this happen. But I think we do need to think of creative ways in which our role would be across the diaspora, and thinking of the different ways that we can have these cross-cultural linkages that build up a solid foundation for United States of Africa.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, one thing going off of that, the diaspora is the 6th region. I learned about this back in 2015 in a conversation I had with Dr. Leonard Jeffries, where everyone had this idea that the 6th region was going to mean what we meant by the African diaspora. Asante touched on this during his lecture a second ago, where the issues about paradigm is about basically the foundation of what do we mean by diaspora. So when we're talking about diaspora, we're coming about it from a Pan-African understanding.
Tariq, we lost your sound after you said a Pan-African understanding. Tariq, can you hear us?
The UK to France to United States.
Okay, Tariq, after you said Pan-African understanding, you lost your sound.
So our understanding of Pan-African, we have a Pan-African understanding of what diaspora means. We're talking about Black people wherever they are, you know, whether it be the Jamaica, the UK, or the US, where when the African Union is using the word diaspora, they're talking more from a national perspective. They're saying Nigerians who have immigrated to the UK, to the US, that's the people who they are referring to in the 6th region. So if we want to talk about getting involved with the African Union or getting involved with any project, we need to first get on terms with what do you mean when you say diaspora? What do you mean when you say the word African? Who is African? Who is the diaspora? So there's basic understandings that we have to come to before we can actually get to work.
I agree with that, but I want to do a plus. I want to add some more context to it. I agree with that, but I also think that just as we have different understandings across our own communities in the diaspora with folks that don't acknowledge our own Africanity, there are folks on the continent that do recognize the 6th region as including Africans or descendants of Africans. And so one example of that is yesterday we held a African Liberation Day a virtual symposium, I guess, because you can't do anything other than that. And the African Union sent their own video of solidarity from Kofi Kwesi Kwartey, who's a deputy of the African Union Commission. And it was in celebration and in solidarity with the diaspora in the context we're talking about. And so I think that I agree with you, there's varying levels of it, but I don't want us to think, to assume that everyone on the continent is outright not recognizing us as part of Africa.
I appreciate that, Sister Jam.
I think on that note, I think it's important to also look at Article 29.1 of the AU's Constitutive Act. And Honorable Ambassador Kwesi Kwartey is he's a personal friend of mine. You know, he's spoken at African Studies, and we've had this conversation before. But according to Article, he's the deputy chair of the AU as mentioned. So according to Article 29.1 of the AU's Constitutive Act, only African states can be a part of the African Union. And that's what was cited when Haiti was rejected when they applied in 2016 to join the AU. Meanwhile, in the same year, Morocco applied to join the AU and they were accepted. So this really begs the question of, we have to interrogate this idea of what is the 6th region if we're supposed to be a part of it. Like, do we have any vote when not a single state of ours? Because if you reject Haiti, then who else isn't going to be rejected, you know, as part of this? I think another thing to interrogate is just this, I think the intellectual deficiency of taking something called the United States of America, or as I prefer, the United Snakes of America, and then just trying to graft that concept onto Africa and say, well, let's get us a United States of Africa. When you look at African fundamentalism by Nana Marcus Garvey, he wrote about a Negro empire on which the sun will never set. So he wasn't just talking about the continent. And I think that, you know, it's the poverty of thought that leads us to this idea of, okay, well, they have a US of A, we're gonna get us a US of A as well. I think that another thing to point out, and I think, well, Prof. Asante mentioned this, and you also did, Moale, about this idea of African nationalism versus Black nationalism from the autobiography of Nana Kwame Nkrumah. And this is problematic in that as long as we're stuck in conceptual incarceration of the English language, there's a separation between African and Black. But when we're speaking our own languages in Chi or Bibini, the Bibi translates to Black, and that's the way to say African. And Yoruba, Adulawa, the Du translates to Black, and that's the way to say African. If you look at Wolof, Nit Kunyul, the Nyul is the Black, and that's the way to say African. If you look at Bamanakan, Farafin, that's the way to say Black, and then it's also the way to say African. If you look at Kikongo, Bandombe, this is now plural, where you say Ndombe is Black, and that's the way to say Africans. If you look at Igbo in DCOG, you're saying these are the literally black heads, and that's the way to say African. And then even if you look at non-African languages, so if you look at Greek, Ethiops, right? This is used to apply to the whole continent where Ethiopia comes from, that they're saying this is the land of those of black, face. If you even look at the Arabic language, so that we got these Arabs in North Africa, that in their own language, Sudan, when they say Bilad as Sudan, they're saying this is the land of black people. But when we go to the source of all of this, Kemet, right? We call ourselves Kemetiu, which is to say black people. The root of that is Kem, which is to say black, and we call ourselves Kemetiu. So when Prof. Asante said, we've never had this idea, we've never had an ideology or something, that is patently false, if you don't mind me saying so, because when you actually read the primary text, if you read the autobiography of Imahu Weni, it talks about bringing together every single type of black person to drive these Eurasians out. If you read Sanhat, it talks about building the walls of the ruler to prevent the Amu from coming in. If you read the prophecy of Imahu Neferti, it talks about how these Eurasians come in, bring death and destruction, rape and ravishing, pillage and plunder. However, the ruler Amini will rise up and drive them out, that the Eurasians will fall to the sword, and those who had invaded Libya will fall to the flame, and then Ma'at will return to her seat while Isfet is driven away. I think the only way that we can make a case that we haven't had that before is when we're not familiar with the primary text of our own ancestors. And I think, and this is really going to my point, and I'll close on this because lots of people have stuff to say, that as long as we use this term Africa, which is the defeated province of Rome, Provincia Africa Proconsularis, that once they defeat Cartadas, then they refer to their defeated province as Africa, then we're going to continue seeing the same thing, because there's nothing in all the 8 different proposed etymologies, nothing about that word tells you that this is the land of black people. But as soon as we go to our own languages, the way to express Africa is in these languages, the land of black people. So that gives us the orientation of, well, hold on, then what are you doing on our land? You understand? And then we actually continue the mission of our classical Kemetiu ancestors and drive out Isfet while Ma'at can return to her seat.
I want to say little things here. I think that the ideology may have exist, but it wasn't articulate. That's my argument on this one. That's what I would disagree with the Dr. Kumbani, if I can disagree a little bit. It's true that we might have the idea that we are black people and that we are family, but I think an ideology is specific for the actual time where you live in too. Where Afrocentricity, what Afrocentricity to me is the consciousness of a specific situation, an ideology of a specific situation where like we have most of African dispersed around the world. And this is a situation that we don't have, like when we look through our history, is not something that we really, it's not something that we really experience. So for a different situation, you have a different type of thought, something different has to be articulated. What was interesting with the discussion you have with Dr. Asante for me is, and something I saw is, it's a story I usually share with people when like there's this old man walking in the middle of the street, and between like is walking in this street that's kind of divide 2 plantations, and the man is wearing on one side like he was wearing a hat, on one side is blue, on the other side is red, and from the different plantations, the people who are cultivating the land, they see different colors. So when they ask, oh, what was the color of the hat of the person, they will say like, oh yeah, it's blue. Or on the other side, they will say it's red. And even when we discuss about the African issues, the United States of Africa or the diaspora, or the actual things, is like we have confronted the issue from a different angle, and it's never forced. They're really complementary. I feel like for us, in order for us to have like a clear idea of what needs to be done, and what makes this discussion really interesting is like we can say that Kwame Nkrumah, he was seeing the issue as being like, okay, we need to have like, we have to take what is African and socialism, because it is kind of antinomic, or what's the term, like it's antagonist with capitalism. It was like you had to marry both Africanity and being African and socialism in order to fight imperialism. When you have like in a diaspora, like in the Americas and also elsewhere, we have actually they're living with white people, and they see like they clearly see that whatever is like whatever is socialism, capitalism, or whatever white people have, and they even able to see that white people are actually fighting amongst each other because of those particular issues. They clearly can see that, like we don't fit on we don't fit in any of those sides. We're not part of this. We have to be ourselves. In Africa, they didn't have this type of information, so they were just trying to. They never figure out what was really going on, and that's, to me, is an issue. And this is something I thought that was interesting in your discussion with when Dr. Asante was speaking about the idea that when he was talking about Kwame Nkrumah, the way he approached the United States of Africa, and the way also Marcus Garvey, who traveled through the Americas and elsewhere, but never actually went in Africa. So the struggle from a different angle. It wasn't force, it was experience. The white supremacy system, white people ideology, a different way that African in the continent have experienced. What I'm seeing is happening at this time is what in chemistry we call osmosis. That means that you enter, like me as an African guy from the continent, when I came in America, I have to go through a reprogramming where like I have to see what is to be African in a different part of the world, a different experience that helped me to understand what is happening globally. You know what I mean? So I'm going to stop here, but that's what I think was great with the conversation. I'll wait for that.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah. You can jump in. And after Shakara, I'm going to, unless someone else has something, I think everybody will weigh in at this point, but then I'll ask my first question after you, Brother Shakara. So,
two very quick points. One point of agreement and one point of very respectful departure. The first point is I very much look forward to Dr. Asante's next book. I think that the dichotomy that he refers to in terms of Marxism, kind of heavily redefining Pan-Africanism, part of the reason for that in terms of how history has developed is the intellectual tradition that has come out of the socialist schools of Pan-Africanism, so to speak. And Nkrumah himself wrote 19 books, many of which I would actually consider required reading, to be honest with you. As much as I harmonize with Baba Asante's perspective in terms of Nkrumah, I do believe that the balance of that is that his work is there is still validity in his work. Like, for example, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, I think is an excellent work, as is the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. And even for its contradictions, I believe that they're texts that need to be engaged by Africans in this day and age. However, the more Black nationalist element of our Pan-African movement hasn't had the same level, of intellectual or scholarship tradition from an ideological perspective when it relates to politics and economics. We've matched everybody in terms of spirituality and culture and history, but political, science, and the social sciences, our socialist brothers and sisters seem to have, outshipped us over the generations in that regard. And so I look forward to his contribution to, readdressing that balance, so to speak. I very much look forward to it. And I harmonize with much of what he had to say around that. My respectful point of departure is on, and both of my points are ideological at this stage. My respectful point of departure is in relation to Gaddafi. and the quote of Gaddafi. And I want to suggest that Gaddafi was duplicitous at best, and I say duplicitous at best. And if it was, the case, yeah, that if the statement that was quoted was in the heart and the mind of Gaddafi, the first thing Gaddafi would have done is abdicate the throne, so to speak, and hand over the reins of power to the disenfranchised Africans in Libya. You know, and if time allows, maybe we can go into that a bit more. But for now, just to say that the work of Baba Chinwezu makes it clear that this was not a Pan-Africanist. In fact, this was not even an African. so the fact of him being a Pan-Africanist is not really in question. But yes, that's my very respectful point of departure. Having said that, I just want to once again just give thanks for being on this panel with Africans who are engaging these issues. I do treasure the opportunity.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Brother Shakara. Sister African Esquire, you didn't get a chance to hear the commentary with Dr. Asante, correct?
I did not.
All right, cool. All right, so listen, I'll just go right into my first question then for the panel, and anyone on the panel can take this question. So the title of today's discussion is Reimagining a Movement Towards a Unified Africa. And I didn't say United States of Africa, I said towards a unified Africa. So my first question is, and this is to each of the panelists, which do we think is a better direction? Should we be moving towards an international unification with a continental base, or should it be a continental-wide political unification with different poles of influence, so to speak? Because if it's continental-wide, then by definition, it's multiracial. Whereas though if it's an international with a continental base, then it's monoracial, right? So what do you guys think that we should be pursuing in terms of the unification of Africa? And I guess in answering this question, it will help to understand what and who are you defining as Africa. So I'll pose that question to the entire panel. Anyone feel free to jump in and answer.
Okay, so I'll bite just because nobody has hopped up yet. So I think one thing that needs to be discussed, so Nalchin Wezu, whose name has been mentioned a couple of times, he taught a course actually twice through Bibi Tumi called The History of Pan-Africanism. And in it, one thing that he problematized was even the idea that unity is the goal, right? So when you look at, the writings of Nana Marcus Garvey, he speaks specifically about power, right? And what he says is that power is actually the goal, but through a bait and switch, and I discussed this yesterday, this aggressive ideological mimicry, where we come for power, but by the time we get there, say, oh, you wanted power? Oh, don't worry about that. Here's some unity for you. That, we have to even deal with, is that the goal? Is that the end goal? Because it's very possible and probable, and we can actually find many examples where people come together, like we were unified in the experience of enslavement, right? We were unified in the experience of colonialism. But now if you picture, millions and millions of Africans who are unified with bows and arrows up against an atom bomb, then this is not, what it is. What's really the issue is the disparity of power. So what we're actually looking for is power in order to defeat these Eurasians, not just for us to be unified. And the example that he gives is, if you have a whole bunch of snails, that no amount of unity among them can, protect them from the elephant's mortar legs as it steps on them. So again, I think that this is one thing that we need to problematize from the outset. Is the goal unity whatsoever? Because when you read the 1900 declaration from the Conference on Pan-Africanism in London, what they talk about is creating a great central Negro state. And again, Nana Marcus Garvey took up that same thing, that we have to have a great central Negro state. And the idea is that this is what will protect Black people, right? To have power, not just to unify for the sake of unification, but to actually get power. And I think that even power itself, we have to think about it, that the ultimate goal is collective Black survival. So if we get caught up in unity and it's not necessarily about collective Black survival, then that's not it. if we say we're trying to get power, that's most likely the way to ensure collective Black survival. But I think that that's one thing that we need to consider. But just off the bat, to answer your question directly, I'm against trying to unify with my first rapists, enemies, colonizers, imperialists, these Arabs on stolen land, these Dutch Boers. What we need is Black people, right? Kemetu, again, right? This is our ancient term, Kemetu, coming together in order to have Black power for the collective Kemetu survival thrust, rather than a unification between this, that, and the third.
Okay. Anyone else on the panel?
I'll go. So I agree, Dr. Obadale, I believe how you say it. I definitely agree with the assessment that we have to look at it as having power among Africans who are actually African on the continent. But I do think that there's a difference between unity and solidarity. We have to keep in mind that when Africa's free, and I believe Africa will be free, there is going to be enemies back to back to back. Not only Europe, not only US, not only Asia, everywhere you go outside, there are people who want what Africa has. So definitely we have to have unity and within the continent among those who are African, because the relationship between the Arabs and the Africans has shown that anytime that Africans are welcoming to people who are not like us, they're always going to take advantage of us and they're always going to exploit us. At the same time, all of us in some ways are fighting colonialism on different fronts. And so I say that to say, this is not a blanket statement that every single Arab country could be in solidarity with Africans. But I think over time, we've seen that there are times where it's in our interest to have solidarity with outside countries, such as Cuba, such as Libya, different countries that are fighting against the bigger giant, being whether it be the United States or whether it be Asian countries.
So firstly, on this point, I believe that there's a distinction between nationality and nationhood that needs to be identified. We have to define what our nation is and organize upon that basis fundamentally. And I believe that so the term transnational may be used, but in the sense of the fact that if we are dealing with Africans, then we have to have an internationalist understanding of what it means to be African, in the sense of the fact that we are around the world. And quite fundamentally, there's a book that is referenced in Blueprint for Black Power by Nana Amos Wilson. It's by a European by the name of Joel Cochran. It's called Tribes, yeah? Forgive me, because it's on my bookshelf and the subtitle is slipping me at the moment. But it's about how different nations or quote unquote ethnicities have formed global tribes, yeah? And redevelop the idea of nationhood around their global tribes. And so, and that is basically how they've secured power in today's world. I would draw a distinction also between the idea of solidarity and strategic alliances. Strategic alliances is a strategy of war, but at the same time, the major contradiction where certain parts of Africa is concerned is that an alliance with non-Africans who may be fighting quote unquote the West may be a contradiction if those same people have not been able to overcome their prejudice against Africans within their own nations and within their own borders, if that makes sense. And so it would suggest to me that any solidarity with such people would be predicated upon the extent to which that reality has ceased. I see no other basis for solidarity in that relationship. So, for example, using Libya as an example, can we form a strategic alliance with Libya when they're enslaving African people? I think most of us generally would say no. That would be a fundamental contradiction. And so, yeah, I think that just needs to be pointed out where that is concerned. But initially, what I'm saying is that nationhood is the concept that we need to be defining and identifying under. What is our nation and how does it formulate? You know what I'm saying? So the fact that we have Africans in the Caribbean, which are majority Black nations, yeah, that can still be a part of Africa if we define it so, and these kinds of things. So yeah, that's what I point out.
Okay. Brilliant, Brother Shaka.
I think one thing is when we talk about the situation that we're in, we focus so much of our energy on the West. But like Dr. Cambone said, if we study our history, we start to realize that there's more things going on. For example, we know that the Arabs, well, really the Asians, they had practiced imperialism and enslavement on the African continent before the Europeans even set foot there, right? We can look at many different empires, the Persian Empire, we have many different dynasties from the Arabs. We have the Turks. We have the Hittites. We have all the Hyksos. The list goes on and on and on. And it basically, it brings forth this question about loyalties, right? And ontology, because
Brother Tariq, we lost your audio. He probably can't hear me either.
that brings
Brother Tariq, we lost your audio after you said ontology.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear.
All right, I apologize. So when they come, they bring their ontologies and they reinforce their ontologies as paramount. So Malcolm X said, when we're talking about African unity or unity with Black people, we need to leave our religions at the door. But that's the exact opposite of what we need to do. We need to bring the idea of religions and these foreign loyalties to the forefront. Because if you guys have studied the history of Zanzibar, which is a prime example of this, they were able to get rid of the British, and then the British set up the Arabs in power, right? And the Arabs were still ruling. And then John Okello led a Pan-Africanist revolution on the island of Zanzibar and dismantled the Arab power structure. But because the majority of the island was still Muslim, that the Arabs were able to slowly regain their foothold in society. And without questioning who our allies are, what we believe in, and who is included in what we think is our group, we're going to allow the same power structures to return.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in on the first question before I go to the next?
Well, I wasn't going to go much deeper into it. I feel like most of the other panelists expressed some of my same thoughts. I am for an international attempt at a unified Africa with the continent as a base. I do think that we do need to go back, return to the source in terms of how we conceptualize what it is, who it is that we are, and how we come about with organizing structures for governance, or even in attempts to get power. What type of power are we trying to get? And what do we mean when we say power?
All right, so that was actually brilliant, Sister Jam. So I appreciate that additional contribution.
Sorry, Robert, can I just throw a phrase in here?
Yes, sir.
This may kind of challenge something that Baba Asante said. However, what's a woman who I consider to be a spiritual mother, Mama Mirimba Ani, says that we must clearly define, what our goals are. And so in her offering in terms of clear definition is world African sovereignty. And I think that may be a helpful addition to the conversation.
I appreciate that. I know I know, Dr. Asante pitched the idea that sovereignty is a false European concept that came out of the 30-year wars in Europe. And just from conversations with my elder, I'm going to call Dr. Obadele my elder, I know that there's also the concept of sovereignty has been problematized in that, you know what, Dr. Obadele, I'll give you 60 seconds here before I ask the next question, just to speak on the sovereignty concept before I go to the next question. You have to unmute. You have to unmute.
Yeah, I had children running around, so I got to keep it on mute every so often. I think that this is one of the numerous bait and switch things where if you look at, and I do have something to say about Gaddafi, but let's say Libya was supposed to be a sovereign nation, but then NATO can go in as it sees fit. Iraq was a sovereign nation, they can go in. Afghanistan is sovereign. Grenada, Nana Maurice Bishop, that's sovereign. Panama, we could look at sovereign nation after sovereign nation, and we can see what that sovereignty got them. So for us to act as though sovereignty is the end goal is basically to put our heads in the sand and ignore that sovereignty means nothing, that if you don't have the power to prevent these Eurasians from kicking in your door, waving the 4-4, then you're not saying anything. Just a quick note on the Gaddafi piece, that in June 1970, Nasser of was now called Egypt, United Arab Republic, what used to be called Kemet, the land of Black people, he proclaimed Gaddafi as the heir of Pan-Arabism. So for those who think that Gaddafi had anything to do with Africa and African, until he decided to declare himself the king of kings in Africa, which he did, then I think we're very lost, because we don't know that his whole thing is Pan-Arabism. And for every second that he was in power, the official name of Libya always had Arab in it. It was only before he came to power and after he was removed from power that the term Arab was removed from the official name of Libya. So I think that we can get very mixed up if we don't realize that the reason why he moved back off the Pan-Arabism is because the other Arabs started to move back away from him after the La Belle bombing and the Lockerbie bombing. So he said, well, let me go to the idiots. Let me go to the prostitutions, the odd mix of prostitute and politician, because all you got to do is give them money and they're willing to bend over and give you an opening. So he just bankrolled the AU and then put white on top, white Arab on top, Black on the bottom, which is the same thing that happens in Cuba. And I'll close on this. I think that's my 60 seconds. Nana Khalid Muhammad said anywhere in the world he's gone, it could be a communist country, but as long as that white-Black dynamic exists, it's white communists on top, Black communists on the bottom. It could be a Muslim country, but it's white Muslims on top, Black Muslims on the bottom. It could be socialist, white socialists on top, Black socialists on the bottom. Capitalist, Christian, whatever it is, as long as that dynamic exists, is white on top, Black on the bottom. And Cuba is a perfect example of that. I put some references in here. Libya is an example of that. So I think that we really do ourselves a disservice if we act like these enemies of the past 5,000 years are anything other than enemies. And again, the texts are there to show that the ideology was there. There's nothing clearer in ideology other than the Stella of Nesubiti Kamos, nothing before or since. So if you haven't read that, then we should pause on saying that there wasn't an ideology and then actually just go and interrogate those primary texts.
Okay, so all right, so before we go to the next question, I just want to see, are we all in agreement here that it sounds like everyone who spoke so far said that the goal should be the political unification of a global Africa rather than a continental Africa. Is that something we agree on before I ask the next question, or is there anyone who disagrees with that?
The goal should be Black power.
I love that. Absolutely, absolutely. But in terms of the
power, you haven't done very much. If you're unified but you're powerless in order to prevent you from for those who are into nature, a good example, you can look up a sardine feeding frenzy, and it shows you all these sardines that are unified, but they get picked off because they don't have the power. There's a power differential. So you can look at that maybe when we're done. So I think that Black power is the actual goal. Unification is the diversion that keeps us sometimes away from even thinking about collective Black survival because we're caught up trying to unify with this, that, and the third.
So let me ask the question in a different way. The expression of Black power by means of a state, should that state be a continental-wide state or a global state?
Global.
Global.
Land of Black people.
Okay, so going back to my initial statement, I would say that we're all in agreement that that state should be one that is global and not continental.
Can I? Because we may be drawing some forced dichotomies here. Yeah, I don't want to separate the global quote unquote state from the continent. Does that make sense? For me, the continent still remains the power base. However else we define, the continent is the capital, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So we said an international unification with a continental base, right, versus a continental unification.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So clearly find that, and the other thing is that I don't know if there's a dichotomy between unity and power, in the sense that it appears logical to me that at least some semblance of critical mass is a prerequisite to acquiring or attaining power, if that makes sense. I think that the idea of unity needs to be clearly defined in terms of the goal that the unity is designed to represent. But I don't know if I don't think we achieve power without, there is no power without a semblance of, or some kind of unity in that regard. So I don't know if
can I briefly touch on this? And again, I'm pulling from a lot of the work of Nachimwezu on this point, that, he goes into this idea that, okay, we have to unite with this, that, and the third. Let's bring these different states or nations together. And then once we unify, which is, basically the Kwame Nkrumah thesis. But what he does is he gives numerous counterexamples, both in terms of military power being achieved without unification with any other state, economic power. So he gives examples of, China that doesn't, say, oh, let me go unify with Japan before now we can pursue power. They get nuclear weapons, and now you're not kicking in the door to China. You could look at Pakistan, India, all these places that have nuclear power. And now, you can't just do what you can do to, say, in Iraq. He gives examples of Singapore in terms of achieving economic power without, as a matter of fact, they broke out from, Malaysia, right? So they were unified initially, but they were like, yo, y'all tripping. We're gonna go off and do our own thing. So they actually split away so that they could attain economic power. So what he does is he gives numerous case studies in terms of the different levels of power, and we can address power as defined by Nana Amos Wilson, where he deals with the force, the influence, the competent and legitimate authority, coercion, manipulation. But he gives examples, counter examples to the idea that we need to be unified with something else before we get power, to show people who have pursued power and have actually attained power in various areas without having to unify with another state, without having to unify with this, that, and the third. So it's not necessarily a dichotomy, but it's just to say we should be wary about perhaps going off on diversions to unify. Oh, we can't do anything until Haiti and Dominican Republic are unified. But if Haiti had nukes, if Haiti had biochemical weapons, if Haiti had whatever, then they wouldn't necessarily need Dominican Republic to do anything other than chill back and let them, take the driver's seat.
I take the point, and not to belabor the point, brother Omwale, so forgive me, but using Nana Amos Wilson as a reference point. Force, people power is a part of force, and so I guess the point that I'm making is that people power as force requires, or a prerequisite to people power as force, is a certain semblance of unity, well defined for a particular purpose. So in all the examples that we're given, for China to separate and do its own thing, it had to achieve unity among those who were considered Chinese, to the point where they had to even redefine their entire identity and give them the impression that they were all descended from one particular definition of what it meant to be Chinese. And so that's what I'm just saying, that there's not necessarily a dichotomy here, but I do take your point, the principle of the point that is being made fundamentally.
Can I just add in something as well, that I think that when you're using the term global, it actually is kind of unifying, because there's a certain realism to that. So for people that are based outside of the continent, in the diaspora, when you're saying global, it still feels that you can contribute, depending on, it doesn't matter where you are, that you can still contribute towards a vision which is kind of unifying within itself.
Excellent point.
I have one thing to say. It's a little bit of pushback on the idea of this global state. I like the idea, but in practical terms, especially for African people that live.
All right, Brother Tariq. Brother Tariq. Okay. So he can't hear me yet.
Brother Tariq, your audio.
He loses audio, and okay, Brother Tariq, we lost you after you said in practical terms.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear.
I said in practical terms, there's only so much power that we can actually attain in those spaces. We're limited. It kind of goes back to like Michael Tillitz's agency reduction formation. we don't have the capability to actually assert ourselves in those spaces. For example, in Philadelphia, where I live, you have the people like the Move movement, and when they created that space for themselves, they were bombed by the state. Or you have Black Wall Street, or you have other people who want to create a space for themselves, and they still have to pay taxes. They still have to obey the European laws. They still have to, you know, if they don't send their kids to school, they might get their kids taken away from them. So I think in a practical sense, when we talk about a global African state or a global, when we're talking about unity, we need to look at where people are, and is that space that they're in at that moment even the right space to be in the first place?
But earlier on in the early speech, Dr. Asante spoke about the Pan-African Congress that took place in Manchester in 1945. And this was a time when we had an unofficial or not a legalized colour bar in the UK, yet that still happened. And it was because of Black people of African origin, coming together, pooling their resources and pulling that off. And one of the things that I do in the school is I teach young people about that Congress, who funded it. It was totally Black-led, Black-funded, so that they recognize within this confined space, we can still achieve. So I think it's important to recognize that we can still achieve. We've been living in these confined spaces for, you know, a very long time, and yet we still achieve and we still thrive. So I still think it can be done, but I think it's just about being able to contribute to a bigger picture than just that immediate moment.
I'll go to the next question. I do think it's very important for us to understand like the concept of a global Africa with a state that is centered on the African continent. For an example, if we look at the political creation of the nation of Israel, right? I went to a university where there were a lot of Jewish people, and these people were American citizens, but because of them embracing their Jewish identity, they were allowed to go back. Every male, when he's I think 18 years old, can go back to Israel. Not even go back, can go to Israel to get military training for 1 year. Because no matter where you live on this planet, you can be a part of the Jewish national defense. So I think that there can be something much more greater, but very similar on the African continent if we were to develop an African state that is centered on the continent that exists for the sole protection of African people globally. But as Dr. Obadele has stated, it has to be powerful enough to do that. So that is something that all of our loyalties can be put towards, and it can be a true Pan-African state. But the only way for that to do that is for our national or colonial identities to be uprooted. So with that being said, let me just segue to my second question, because this panel, I have everybody wants to contribute. So this is a great panel. So my second question is, what are the barriers to achieving this global political unification in terms of institutions, identities, and ideologies? I'll repeat the question. What are the barriers to us achieving a global political unification in terms of institutions, ideologies, and identities?
I'm going to say the first one is operational unity. And I'm saying that knowing the conversation that we just had here, but please bear in mind that the word unity is prefixed by the word operational. And I hope people understand what I mean. In the sense of the fact that we understand where we are at the moment in terms of the diversity of thoughts, among us as African people. So it suggests that we need to be organized among people that ideologically think the way that we do and maximize that ideological expression. But it also suggests that coming from the position that we are in at the moment, we also need to find ways of organizing with people that don't necessarily share our specific ideological premises, if that makes sense. And that's just, for me, it's just a reality of where we are at the moment, if that makes sense. For example, I am a dedicated African spiritualist. I am very heavily critical of the Eurasian religions and their impact upon African people, and I think that we will be best served by returning to our original traditions and evolving them. However, I also have to confront the reality that the majority of us don't share my convictions, yeah? And so there's two things to do here. The first thing is to organize with those who do share my convictions, and then there are those on that particular subject. And then there are those who may not share my convictions on that particular subject, but share my convictions in other areas of people activity, that we need to develop some kind of operational relationship that allows us to do things in the present whilst, you know, we are working on whatever our ideologies specifically state is the ultimate goal. And I think that we're yet to achieve that at the moment. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, so I hope that makes sense in a convoluted kind of way.
I believe the barrier, depending on where you are, so coming from the US, I'll say is an identification of being African. Most Africans in the US who are descended from slavery, they disengage from the idea that we are African. Instead, we say African American, or we'll say Black, or some don't even want to say those. Some just want to be American. So as far as the diaspora, I think there has to be first an understanding that we are African. As far as different ideologies, I do take the stance that Malcolm X took, that someone said it earlier, that we're just not going to agree on everything. I mean, this is, when you look at pan-Europeanism, different ideologies has never been a barrier to being able to come together on what they had in common. And what we as African people have in common is, number one, a history, but number two, a common enemy. And that has to be the first motivating factor. You know, we have to, I'm a Christian. I have no problem working with the African spiritualist. I have no problem working with a Muslim, because to me, what we all have in common is that we are all being exploited. We're all being colonized. And if we don't put that aside, then those differences of opinions or differences of ideologies are going to play into the hands of the oppressor. So to me, it's just a prioritization of the fact that we all have something in common, regardless of what region, regardless of what language, and what commonality we have to let that be the motivating factor in leading our direction.
Anyone else? Institutions, ideologies?
I agree with what I apologize, but what the sister just said there, I totally agree with that in regards to, I feel that there is a lot of, the issue is divisiveness, and it's always been about divide and conquer. Ever since the concept of race and colonialism, it's always been about divide and conquer. And then we see that being repeated. And I can't remember who it was, but somebody had done a tweet the other day that I responded to, and it was just a really divisive tweet. It just sent people this way and that. And I said, ultimately, what matters though, is that as a people identify, whether you identify as Black or African, we are subjected to a global system of oppression, whether you want to call that white supremacy or whether you want to call that white fragility, which people again argue over. It's still a system that is based on the denigration of our skin color and heritage, and we should be united on that. If we could, so we don't have to agree on everything else, but recognize that global system of oppression. I think that's a very strong base to move forward from, and not even from a negative aspect, to recognize why that system was set up, and then to work forward from there. So I completely agree with what the lady said, is that we don't have to agree on everything, but it's about recognizing this global system, which is about denigration of anything that comes from the continent.
I would agree with that as well. I think some of our top barriers are, as was mentioned earlier by African Esquire and Marsha, knowledge of self, and lack of knowledge of our own cultural heritage and knowledge. At the very beginning of this discussion, Dr. Cabone pointed out that we do have a lot of these ideologies. We do have our own concepts of thinking when it comes to unification, when it comes to sovereignty, when it comes to the ways in which we live our lives as African people. The text is there, the history is there, but a lot of us lack knowledge of self. We know why. We can't really blame the masses of people because that's part of the indoctrination against self for us not to have that knowledge. So first barrier is knowledge of self. And then another barrier is lack of awareness. When we have a lack of knowledge of self, then we have people cheering for our own demise, clearly off of a lack of awareness of what is happening on a global scale. For example, Sister African Esquire mentioned, there are certain people that don't even want to be called not even just African or Black. They want to be called American specifically, and that's it. And then at the same time say that they have a Black agenda. You cannot have a Black agenda if you don't frame what's happening to us within a global context, because we're African people and what we're experiencing is because we're African people and the hatred of African people by our enemies. So we have to have this centered awareness. And then we have to have confidence, which our ancestor Marcus Garvey told us that is what we need in order to move forward. We have to have confidence of self. When that will come with knowledge of self and awareness. When we have confidence of self, going back to another point that I love, a lot of the points raised by Dr. Cabon, is that when you have confidence of self, you know that you can lean on Sankofa. You know that you do have the answers for your own life. We don't have to have a United States of Africa. We can conceptualize something else completely. There was a person on Twitter the other day that was saying, well, what will happen if one president is ruling all of us and all that power? And I could just see it going crazy. And I'm saying, who said we want one president? Who said that we have to even have unified under that lens? We have our own things that we need to go back to and interrogate and study in order to move forward. And so when we have confidence and we understand that we have our own things, we can start conceptualizing societies and the ways in which the world works best for us. Another barrier is, of course, sellouts. There's always going to be those people, the same people that snitched on Nat Turner and everybody else that will be there. And I think that goes back to the point of unification, where I see both points where Dr. Cabon was talking about being weary of focusing just on unification, and Brother Chakra was saying that we need unification for power. There's something in between those points. There are some people that will be left behind. Marcus Garvey said, we don't want to take all Black people to Africa because some of y'all are no good here and you're not going to be any good in Africa. So unfortunately, we do have to be cautious of who the whole everybody, things, because there are some ideologies that are viruses that attack our ability to move forward as a collective or move forward in the scope of seeking power. There are people that are Black, that are African, that we cannot trust, unfortunately, that we can't put under that whole scope of unity. I see some panel discussions where certain people are included, and I know for a fact that these people are preaching things that are divisive, things that really align with American imperialism, and I wonder why Pan-Africanists are putting them on these panels, and it's because, well, we want unity. And I'm not unifying with somebody that is preaching divisive, hateful rhetoric towards other African people around the world. And we have to be cautious of that. So we have to understand that when we have this self-awareness, when we build up our confidence, we have to also include a level of discernment on who we can trust in order to build. If we don't do that, then all that work will be for naught. And then, of course, a barrier is our enemies, the people that don't want to see us succeed. So they will plant these ideals and they'll use it under the guise of scholarship. So, for example, I did some pre-reading before this panel on, different concepts of United States of Africa. And I came across this really interesting article called 5 Reasons the United States of Africa Will Not Work. And it was by this organization called African Liberty. And then when you investigate who owns or who operates African Liberty, it's one of the Koch brothers. They founded an organization that then changed. It used to be literally under Koch Foundation. It changed its name to Cato Institute, and now they have Africa Liberty or African Liberty, and they are putting out these different articles sowing misinformation about what it means to have a unified Africa. So we have to be cognizant that our enemies are attacking us, not just with violence, physical violence, but mental and scholarly violence that we don't pay enough attention to. And so when we have people doing research or saying that they have the data, the data or the facts is false or built on anti-Black rhetoric. I'm sure I've talked way too long here, but I had another point, but I think I'll stop there.
Well, listen, if you find your other point, I am going to welcome you to come back in and drop it, because you was just giving fire right there. Like, there's so many people clapping in the chat room right now. Like, we appreciate you for that right there. That was amazing.
I just want to applaud the sister's ability to use all kinds of euphemism without mentioning the people that she's talking about. It's beautiful. That's what you get me. But yeah, I get you. I get your point clearly, my sister. Yeah, beautiful. And I just want to say that in relation to that, the one of the key aspects coming out of that is this idea of information. We live in an information age, whereby media or information is actually information and ideas is the primary currency of power. Yeah, and so we are enslaved or liberated by the ideas that we hold fast to. That is just the reality of the situation. As it stands at the moment, touching on what the sister has just said, the concept of Pan-Africanism has been so redefined, morphed and perverted, so to speak, that neo-colonialism looks like Pan-Africanism, and blatant neo-colonial leaders can use Pan-African language and Pan-African rhetoric in the forwarding of neo-colonial agendas, and with euphemisms like development and free market, and all them strippiness there, and we look at it and think, right, it's Pan-Africanism. And so the point that I'm making is that we are 100 years ago, the UNIA-ACO, inaugurated this flag that is across my chest and elected a government in exile, in order to basically wipe out the colonizers on the continent. But one of the things that they were able to do is master the media of their time. Yeah. And so they were able to draw hundreds of thousands of Africans to meetings and millions of Africans around the world, because their agenda for mastering the dispensation of information was second to none. And we have yet to replicate the model that they did in that time. But the idea of media and information is actually more critical today than it was 100 years ago. And so one of the key barriers is that we don't control the information. We don't control the ideas that our people are responding to or considering, even as it relates to Black and African liberation. And so that to me is one of the primary barriers.
Brilliant.
If I can also hop in on this, I don't know if you were trying to move on, but if I can also
no, you can hop in. I'll have one final questions after this, and then I'll open it up for Q&A.
Okay. Can I share my screen?
Yep, you can share. You can share.
Okay, saying that the host disabled participant screen sharing. I think I may have to be a co-host to do so. Okay, I think that did it. Yeah, so this is something that I touched on briefly yesterday, but it's a conceptual framework that I'm working on. And what you see on the left and right are two types of fireflies. And on left is a firefly called Photurus, and on the right is the one called Photinus. And what Photurus does is that it mimics the glow of the female Photinus firefly. And in doing so, it's a much bigger firefly. So now when the male comes thinking that it has a potential mate, it actually comes and gets eaten alive. And this is what's called aggressive mimicry in the animal kingdom in ethology. And this is very similar to what goes on, what I call aggressive ideological mimicry. And on the road to Dodua, they have something called Pan-African Theological Seminary. So you have people who are using Pan-African in ways that the people who invented the word did not necessarily mean it. You have Pan-African savings and loan here in Ghana. People just use this word willy-nilly, but then more so, this is the aggressive ideological mimicry where you're coming for Pan-Africanism, which is all about the Black survival thrust. But when you get there, what they start talking about is all African this and all African that. And what they mean is white Arab on top, Black people on the bottom. So I think that that's one barrier in terms of the ideological piece, is that if you have people who are able to simulate and mimic the visual, right, and the acoustic cues and signals that actual Pan-Africanists give, right, they may adopt, instead of the red, black, and green flag, they may have a red, black, green, and yellow flag, or a red, black, green, and white flag like Gaddafi in Libya, right? So this is something that becomes very confusing, where just like the Fultina's flag that comes out is coming thinking, oh, I'm coming to the Black survival thrust, but when it gets there, it becomes part of the world socialist revolution, hooking up with the white proletariat and whatever. That's one. Another one is what the sister Jessica briefly mentioned in terms of sellouts. I have a comprehensive framework called Vectors of Compromise and Co-optation. And what this is that you have all these just like you have vectors of disease, like, puddles of stagnant water for malaria is a vector of disease. They have vectors of compromise, one of which is through money. So you can compromise and co-opt someone by giving them the right amount of money, like Gaddafi did to bankroll the AU. You can do so through their jobs, right? So employment is another vector of compromise. You have another one, a genetic vector of compromise, what Nana Marcus Garvey talked about, miscegenation. So you have somebody who's a mulatto. So we're all talking about what to do for Black people, but then they're thinking, well, my white mama, I got to think about her. Or because they're trying to marry some white Arab like Nana Kwame Nkrumah did, whatever the case may be, all of these are vectors of compromise. So I think that, you can look at this in terms of not just the money part, in terms of the selling out literally, but all of the various things, the ideological vector of compromise. So because you follow Marx or Adam Smith or any other Eurasian, that you're no longer thinking about what to do for Black people, you're following, ideological, the religious vector of compromise. So we're all talking about what to do for Black people. And, you may be thinking about, well, what about my imaginary white boy on the stick? What is he going to do about this? What does he think about this? Or you're praying to a rock in the desert 5 times a day. So now you're compromised because we're talking about what to do for Black people. And you, on the other hand, are talking about, I need to go make my pilgrimage to Mecca or whatever. Another point is in terms of definition, the term African opened up a loophole where there's a difference between African and Black and African. So we're not using our indigenous languages where those are not separate nor separable concepts. The common enemy was brought up. And I also think that this, and I'll land on this point, the point was made by Prof. Asante about when they go to Colombia and when they go to these places in Brazil, they don't link with the Black population there. And it's entirely because of this aggressive ideological mimicry where you have a difference between African and Black. So once you think that you're something different, why would you go interact with people there? They're not on the African continent. And you see this enshrined in 29.1 of the African Union's Constitutive Act. And the last point was he had mentioned, they're not invading palaces and whatever. It let me know that Prof. Asante hasn't been to Ghana in some time because the king of Dagbon, the Yana Yakubu Andani, he was beheaded and his elders were mutilated, right? The palace was stormed, and that's how the Abudu and Andani, this clash has been going on for quite some time. So it's not that, once we embrace African culture, now they're not, kicking the door in the palaces. That's still very much going on, just like the British kicked in the door to the Asante Hennes Palace, Manshia, but I'll close on that.
Dr. Obadele, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, all right. All right, cool. So last question for the chat. So I purposely asked, so what are some of the barriers in terms of institutions, ideologies, or identities? I like that our sister Jam Awuya, I know I just butchered your name. I said, okay, cool. She said that certain ideologies can be viruses, and I think that that's brilliant because I think that we have a responsibility to interrogate any ideology we hold and examine if it's a Sealy is anti-African. And if that is the case, then we have a responsibility to, weed it out, just like weeds in the garden, so that we can grow and flourish as a people. But my last question is going to relate to institutions. I wanted us to speak to some of these anti-African institutions or neo-colonial institutions, such as the AU, that exist to maintain foreign control and dominance over the African continent. I want us to take a look at things like African states, as they are so-called African states, because they're really neo-colonial states. So as they're currently constructed, can we achieve a vision of a political unification with a Pan-African state on the African continent while these neo-colonial states are still in existence? Do the one have to be destroyed before we can construct the other, or can they exist simultaneously? So I'll open that question up to the panel, and then I'll ask for Q&A from the viewers, and we'll close out.
No.
Straightforward. So we gotta get rid of Ghana. We gotta get rid of Nigeria. Like there's no taking the fabric of Nigeria, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and merging them together into this new entity called, United States of Africa. We can't do that. We got to destroy it and create something that is specifically African. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
In East
I'll
Africa,
be facetious. I'll try to get somebody else a chance to speak. However, I believe that what we all know that how these nation states come into being. I believe that there's brilliant work being done by many of our cultural scientists, especially in the area of language, that is tracing more viable means, and then we can look at it from an economic perspective as well, in terms of resources and minerals, and these kinds of things. But we need to basically reform, quote unquote, these borders, or just do away with them based upon our own needs and means, especially because of the fact that we have nations, indigenous groups, who are split across these various different nations. And they also prevent us from being able to understand the linkages between our nations in general. So just because one is Yoruba and one is Igbo doesn't mean that ancestrally they are not the same people. And so it appears that these constructs are a direct hindrance to us being able to achieve a more greater unity. Having said that, the road from where we are to the road to where we want to be is a process. And so getting rid of the borders in and of itself as an act doesn't solve the problem. There needs to be a kind of a reculturalization or a reorientation alongside that process that makes the doing away of those borders viable.
The question is open to the entire panel.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
That question came from like right off the dome. So let me.
Right. I remember most of it. I just wanted to make sure I was remembering it correctly. That you were asking, can we recreate or unify with the current states that are in place right now?
I was asking, can our vision of a political unification, a global political unification, be achieved while the colonial states still exist, right? While the so-called African Union and heads of states are still in place. Like, I'm more so trying to get to, for the younger viewers that are watching, what is the project that they need to take up, alongside them obtaining a reorientation, alongside them being, as Brother Shakara said, is reculturalization. Like, do they need to be about working to destroy colonial Ghana or neo-colonial Ghana? Or should they be working to, look at the situation like, oh, we just have bad politicians, and if I get the seat, then, I can change things around and we can make it better. Like, what needs to be the project of the young people? Can this vision of a Pan-African state that exists on the continent that represents a global people, can that exist next to these colonial states that are still in existence, that are headed by neo-colonial rulers, so to speak?
I think that in order for me to have a cohesive argument either way, I really would need to I don't think that I'm the best person to answer that part of the conversation, but I will say this. One of the points that Dr. Asante raised was that that this, whatever we do in terms of unification of Africa and Africans, must be like a mass movement from the people, and it won't come from politicians, and it won't come from the higher ups in government. And so I think that the task at hand is, when we do our reculturalization, when we do our reclamation of self, that we focus on connections in mass movements. And as activists, we don't have to close ourselves off to borders. We can say we're working on this main goal. We know you're working on that where you are. Let's see if we can come together and continue this work through the masses and push it through the masses. It's definitely going to be a process, whichever way that we take, but it won't be successful unless it's a mass movement, unless it's backed up by a mass movement. And so I think that that is one of the main things that we can focus on. And I think we also need to elevate the fact that on the continent, yes, those borders exist, and those that support neocolonialism adhere to them, but everyday people are not adhering to those borders like that. Like if you go to the border of Kenya and Tanzania, they're not taking out a passport to cross. The Maasai are not going to do that. They go across the street because that's what they always have done for thousands of years. And the border concept is still not something that people adhere to. So I think that we can uplift the fact that our own people on the ground already have their own ideals and thoughts of these borders. If we even look at Haiti and Dominican Republic and how the women are meeting at rivers to trade goods and sell back and forth, they're not adhering to those borders. And so I think that when we do our reculturalization and we connect as activists in mass movements, we need to ensure that when we do that, we do it within a borderless lens so that we can continue to push that ideal and uplift the fact that our people are already thinking this way in a lot of different ways. We're just not saying that that's what it is, but we are very much in many different ways already operating borderless.
I absolutely agree with everything Sister Jessica said. And, you know, I also have kind of a difficulty with this. I mean, I've been in Africa one time, and, you know, being in America, I do feel a certain way about understanding that when I meet African brothers and sisters, a lot of them do have identities that they're proud of, be they colonial. For example, if you meet Nigerians or Ghanaians, a lot of them are proud of those countries. And I think that that's something that can be respected while also understanding that the constructs of the countries, which is my main concern, is that these countries were founded to continue an exploitative relationship. So to me, what I try to focus on more so is, I would say, like, stopping the bleeding. Right now, our people are dying in record numbers, and it's been happening for centuries at this point. And before anything else, I think that we can come together by fighting the colonial powers. You know, to me, if we're all calling out things that are happening from the US, from China, or different countries, or even other African countries that are fighting internally, if we are calling out the instances of white supremacy being displayed in our own localities, to me, that will automatically go back to the structures that are allowing these things to happen. So if you're calling out what's going on, I'm just, for some reason, I'm thinking about Ghana, but if you're thinking of calling out the United States military base that they put in Ghana, what does that go to? Well, obviously, there's a relationship between the government and the outside power that the people are not attuned to. And so that means that we have to go back to the Constitution. That means that we have to go back to the Parliament. That means that we have to just go through and actually understand what it is that we are consenting to by paying taxes or being citizens inside of countries that allow these things. And to me, that's where I think for younger people, that's where we need to focus on is what is it that is killing us at such a rate, and let that be the entry point to an overall unity where we can say, okay, why do we have these borders? Why do we have these countries? Why do we have these constitutions? What purpose is it serving? Because it's not serving us. So that's what I would say.
Ashe.
Yeah. Now, my take on it, I posted it in the chat. I think that we should remove the borders within Kemet, that's the land of Black people, but retain the border between Kemet, that's the land of Black people, and Africa. And the term Africa, since it's ever been used, has always been to denote a defeated, occupied territory that's been occupied by non-Black people. So yeah, I think that definitely needs to be the case. And when we, again, look at our ancient texts, this is what the ancient texts talk about. And I may also just share this very quickly. This is the prophecy of Nefertiti, which talks about these Amu, these invaders, and it actually gives us instructions about what we're supposed to do. And this is from a forthcoming article on the classical Kemetu origins of Pan-Africanism. You can just see here that which has these single quotes here. And it says, the Amu travel by their strength. They terrorize the hearts of those upon the harvest, as farmers. They seize the oxen on the plow. A strange bird will breed in the land of marshes, having made its nest beside the people having let it approach due to apathy/indifference. So these are the Eurasians who have come and occupied, Kemet at that point in time. Destroyed and taken away are those things of goodness. All goodness has been expelled. The land is cast down due to misfortune. This could be talking about right now, right? Because of those feeders, Eurasians who roam the land, enemies have appeared in the east. Eurasians have come down into Kemet, the land of Black people. But then it has the remedy for that. It says, this Nesut will come from the south, Ameni, true of voice his name, son of this woman of Taseti, child of the interior of Nechen. He will take the white crown, he will wear the red crown. He will join the two mighty ones. Eurasians, they use the term Amu, and you see that here in the Medu Neter. Eurasians will fall to his sword, Timhu will fall to his flame, rebels to his wrath, traitors due to all of him, the Uraeus on his forehead subduing the rebels for him. And this is the point that's relevant to this specific question. One will build the walls of the ruler to bar Eurasians, again you see Amu there, from entering Kemet, and again Kemet is a land of Black people. They shall beg water as beggars to allow their cattle to drink. Ma'at will come to her seat, Isfet driven to outside. So they give us everything that we need to know. So when we say, oh, well, we never had an ideology, we weren't, it's like, this means you just haven't read the text. Just say, I don't know the text, I haven't read them at all, rather than saying we didn't have it, because this is the clearest statement that, so when I'm saying we should keep the border between Kemet and the occupied territory, that's until we can reclaim that territory. So when we're talking about Black people striving for Black power, we're not saying we're giving up that territory. That territory has already been taken. What we're talking about is to build that base of power in Kemet, in the land of Black people, so that that land can be reclaimed for Black people.
When is this article going to get finished, bro? Man is still waiting, you know, for this article. So have you got a date on it yet?
So I've already submitted it to Journal of Pan-African Studies. However, the editor-in-chief passed away, and I was just informed by Prof. Tracy Fleming that operations are frozen. So my idea is to just leave it with them until operations are unfrozen, or look at Ankh in France, right? Another journal that has, quite a depth of information about Kemet. But the article is done now, and now I'm working on the book.
Understood. I've been waiting since October last year, so I'm just checking it.
It's done. We're waiting for JPass to get back on the road.
Okay, cool.
All right, so we're at an hour and a half here. I'll allow you guys just to have some closing remarks. I really genuinely appreciate each of your contributions to this panel. Again, today's discussion was on reimagining a movement towards a unified Africa. I really do genuinely just appreciate everybody weighing in. I respect each and every one of you. So I'll just some very quick closing remarks, and then I'll just do a quick 10 minutes. I have a few questions that came in from the audience that I want to ask, and then I'll close us out at 5:40. All right, closing remarks, anybody? Y'all can close yourself out. Yeah.
I just wanted to uplift that we have our own things, and that we need to embrace the things that we already have within our cultures. And we have the benefit of an entire continent, from east to west, from south to north, with a plethora of information that we can use as a guiding point for unification. And so when we're reimagining a unified Africa, we can lean on all of these things that we have and use them, and use our own creativity that our ancestors instilled in us to recreate or reimagine the world that we want to see that uplifts African people no matter where we are on the planet.
I would like just to reaffirm the idea that consciousness precedes unity.
Anyone else have any closing remarks you want to give before I give the Q&A questions?
Just real quick, I think a follow-up to what the sister Jessica also said about us having our own thing, that we have a Bibi Tumi, and what this is an African social education network where we only allow Black people equals African people equals Black people to join and to be a part of it. So if you've been tweeting on Cracker platforms and Facebooking and whatever, I would invite you to escape the digital plantation. You know, there's a quote that's attributed to Nana Harriet Tubman. I haven't seen the primary source, but she said, "I freed thousands, I could have freed thousands more if only they knew that they were enslaved." So those of you who are chilling out on the digital plantation, hoping Mark Zuckerberg, Master Zuckerberg, doesn't put you into Facebook jail, there's actually a place where you don't have to worry about getting whipped by the white overseer. You can actually be around Black people, and we can stop being on white platforms talking about how we need to do for self. And then someone gives us 50 likes. Oh yeah, we do. Until the next tweet and the next meme that says, yeah, we need to do for self. We've already done for self. So we've already taken away your tongue to say again how we need to do for self is done. So join us on a Bibi Tumi. On the topic, I would like to say, you know, we've been talking about unity, and I think we really have to be critical and interrogate which type of unity leads to power, because the rabbit hole that we've gone down has been in a striving for unity that does not lead to power. We've been trying to unite with Arabs and unite with Soviets and unite with whatever. And we need to know, hold up, that may be unity or it may be whatever, but that is not the Black survival thrust. That's not Black liberation. That's not Black power. So we need to interrogate which types of unity lead to power and which ones lead to continued genocide. Nana Kwame Ture used to talk about unity of thought versus unity of action, that we can all hop up together, you know, in a rebellion, but when it comes down to, you know, having unity of thought, we often lack in that regard. But I think what it really comes down to is building with those instead of trying to, you know, get everybody on the same page. Once I know that there are 10 people on the page, then I'm not up here trying to debate with y'all who aren't on the same page. I'm building with those who are on that page until we can build that nation that is a counterbalance to destroy that white nation, because the ones that are there. And then a closing thought, I think we can also introduce terms of Kemet of our own people, and that one is Samatawi, which is the unification of the two lands, which can be Kemet, meaning what is still the land of Black people on the continent, and then Kemet Nha, which is the land of Black people in the diaspora, which includes Haiti, which includes you know, West Papua New Guinea, Mekamui, so-called Bougainville, the Sentinel Islands. Those folks is real. We need them to be border patrol for real, right? So we can start thinking about that, and then stop using all these terms that are, Greco-Roman terms, unite or whatever, and start using our own terms so that we can conceptualize what that looks like from our own worldview.
Brilliant, brilliant. Sister Marsha, any closing remarks?
Yeah, I think it's, for me, I was just thinking on Walter Rodney's work and the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and Who Owns Means of Production, how entrenched and connected the metropoles are to the African continent, and the fact that they need the resources from there. And that for me is a really big area that needs to be looked at and explored more, and particularly in relation to corruption. The other point is around the term mulatto. That term comes from the Spanish word for mule. Mules are a cross between a donkey and a horse, and they're different species. And so mulatto was applied to people who have one black parent and one white parent, reaffirming the concept of race, which is a white supremacist concept, that black and white were different species. A mule is sterile; they cannot reproduce, and so that was applied to people who had one black and one white parent. And I think language can be very important. It can actually be a barrier to people engaging fully in these kind of discussions. So I think that it was just to make that point about the term mulatto.
Much respect on that point, Sister Marsha. Did everyone get a chance to give their closing remarks?
Just me. Sorry, I had to run and grab
Okay.
them. But I would just say, in closing for me, is that we have to look at the past and learn from it. A lot of times, I think when we're talking about things like United Africa, we're not keeping in mind that a lot of the things that we speak of have been tried before, and that we have an enemy who also studies us. So for me, as I learn and evolve, that is my main goal, that understanding from the lessons of the past that we're trying to do something that has been tried many times. And that requires us to have a unifying identity and understand that we're fighting a system collectively and not separately.
Ashay, I want to support Sister Tiani's last point in terms of learning the lessons of the past. And I also want to support, I know we've had a very ideological conversation today, but that is also important because we do, if we're talking about unified consciousness, that is a conversation that, necessitates ideological kind of conversation and sharpening in that respect. So I do want to emphasize that point. And finally, just to give thanks for the international nature of this conversation. I'm appreciative of another sister from the UK on the panel, so I give thanks. I'm gonna look you up, my sister, and we'll hopefully find each other at some point. And I do happen to have my blueprint for Black Power on hand, so conveniently. So let me just substantiate what I was saying before in terms of the subchapter Force as Power, where Baba Amos Wilson says power as force involves the exercise of biological and physical means to prevent another person or group from doing what he or it prefers to do, or get something to happen to the person or group that he or it would prefer it did not. Yeah. So that's as a basic definition. The idea of it being physical kind of, denotes critical mass in terms of people behind the program. Yeah. So I'm just emphasizing that point. But I think that as our generation of let's just say young Africans, our primary responsibility is to sharpen our people with the ideas of liberation and formulate the organizational structures of liberation. And so I look forward to joining you all in that work in our various fields of endeavor. Give thanks to Namwadi.
All right, family, unfortunately, we are at our wit's end, our limit for today. I, again, want to humbly thank each of the panelists from around the globe for tuning in today. We even got the babies, the future, on the line with us right now. So this is great. Please do continue to follow AI Philly. This is AI Week 2020. I think that we have another event tomorrow, African Liberation Day, which will be a watch party. So if you are not subscribed to our social media, you can follow us on AbibiTumi. You can also follow us on the Cracker platforms, as Dr. Obadele likes to say. We still have a foothold on the plantation as well, so you can check us out there. But also, in addition to that, if you want to sign up for our listserv, if you registered today for this event, your name will be added to our listserv, so you'll receive communications from AI Philly. If at any point you no longer want to receive communications from us, you can always unsubscribe. But again, we thank you all for your support, and we thank each of the wonderful panelists for their contributions today. All right, Hotep and peace.
Shem Hotep.
Shem Hotep.